Hello there. My name is Aiden Foote, and today I'm going to be talking about effective forecasting, specifically biases called immune neglect and focalism. These two ideas help explain why we expect our emotions to hit harder and last longer than they actually do. With that, let's get into it. What is effective forecasting and why is it important? Effective forecasting is basically our ability to predict how we feel in the future. And most of the time, people aren't great at this. We tend to overestimate the intensity and the longevity of negative emotions. So when something bad might happen, we assume it'll completely ruin us for a long time. And usually that's not true. The two mechanisms that help explain this are immune neglect, which has to do with how we recover emotionally, and focalism, which has to do with what we pay attention to. Really quickly, I want to explain how this fits into cognitive psychology. Even though these ideas might sound emotional on the surface, they're actually driven by cognitive processes, things like attention, memory, and metacognition, which is basically how we think about our own thinking. Effective forecasting errors don't mean people are weak or emotional. They mean our brains take shortcuts that sometimes distort our predictions. Neglect and focalism are both examples of cognitive biases, not emotional fragility. Um, the first article I looked at is by Gilbert and his colleagues from 1998. Their focus is on why people think negative emotions will last way longer than they actually do. The key idea is that most of us underestimate something called the psychological immune system, basically, the mental and emotional coping process that helps us bounce back from bad events. The goal of the article is to understand why people make these durability errors in their emotional predictions. Methods of this study. Uh, this study contained, or this article contained 6 different studies, but basically I do not have unlimited time and I'm going to focus on study 2, which is based on the real life tenure process in academia. There are 2 groups of professors in this study. The forecasters, who are the assistant professors predicting how happy they would feel if they received tenure versus if they were denied it. And then the experiencers, who are the professors who had actually gotten tenure or who had actually been denied it. The dependent level here was their level of happiness or the difference between their predicted and actual levels. Um, this is a meaningful test because the tenure decision is a huge life event. So if people ever mispredict their emotions, it would be here in this high stakes event. The results of this study, for the positive outcome, receiving tenure predictions were pretty accurate. Forecasters predicted to feel around the high fives, and actual happiness for professors who received tenure was right around that range. But for the negative outcome, the forecasting participants predicted their happiness would drop much lower than it actually did. People expected the denial of tenure to wreck them emotionally, but the professors who actually went through it reported being happier than predicted. The negative predictions were far too extreme, and that gap is the best example of immune neglect. People don't realize how strong their own coping abilities are until they actually need them. On to Article 2. This second article is by Wilson and his colleagues from 2000 and is focused on focalism. The idea is that when we think about a future event, like a football game, an exam, or pretty much anything emotionally meaningful, we zoom in way too much on that one thing. We forget that a lot of other daily experiences will also affect our mood. The goal of this article was to test whether reminding people of these other daily events could reduce forecasting errors and make predictions more accurate. Um, in this study, participants were college students predicting how happy they'd feel after a football game. They were split into 2 different conditions: the control, where they just predicted their happiness normally, and the diary condition, where they wrote a short list of other things that would be happening that week, like homework, meals, chores, hanging out with friends, etc. The dependent variable here was the predicted happiness versus the actual happiness, as well as how much they thought they'd think about the game. This diary task was meant to broaden their attention and reduce the focalism that was occurring in the control group. Figure 1 here, this first graph on the left shows predicted happiness over the next few days after the football game. The control group shows those really dramatic emotional predictions, super high if the team won or super low if the team lost. The diary group is noticeably more moderate here over time. Although this diary condition had a much lower or a slightly lower first day happiness that was much more negative. Over time, it was more moderate and less emotionally significant. In other words, this diary group did not predict the same emotional extremes because the diary reminded them that life keeps happening and there are other things going on in their life that, yeah. Figure 2 shows predictions about how much participants thought they'd think about the game. This figure on the right. Again, the control group predicts they'll be thinking about the game a ton, almost constantly on Saturday, while the diary group predicts fewer thoughts. And then as the week goes on, the drop off is much greater for this diary group compared to the control group. In both these graphs, you can see that the diary task softened the emotional predictions, which shows that broadening attention actually helps reduce forecasting errors. Right. Just to reiterate that, we can see that there is clear evidence of focalism across both measures, and when attention is broadened, the emotional impact is less. What do authors think it means? The authors argue that these two biases, immune neglect and focalism, help explain why emotional predictions are consistently off. Immune neglect makes us underestimate our resilience, and focalism makes us overfocus on one event and ignore the rest of our life. Together, they can help explain why people think negative emotions will hit harder and last longer than they actually do. Of course, there are some limitations. The emotional intensity of events can vary. Diary tasks help, but they don't fully eliminate the bias, and some emotional events can't be ethically or practically studied. Um, Even with these limitations, these results line up with a lot of later research. So to wrap it up, emotional predictions are flawed because our brains use shortcuts that can distort how we imagine the future. Immune neglect and focalism are two major contributors, as seen in these two articles. By understanding them, we can set more realistic expectations and probably stress less about things that won't actually affect us as much as we think. That's about it for me. Um, Here are my references, Article 1 and Article 2. Thank you so much for your time. And that's it. Bye.